It was 02:14 in the morning, and the Caribbean Sea was pitch black. To the naked eye, the ocean looked completely empty, just a vast stretch of dark water moving quietly under the night sky. But high above, circling at 30,000 feet, the sensors of a P8 Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft picked up something that shouldn't have been there. It wasn't a single blip, it wasn't a fishing vessel or a stray yacht. The radar screen suddenly lit up with 98 distinct heat signatures. They were moving fast, over 50 knots, and they were moving together. This was a white flow of illicit cargo worth over $100 million, heading straight for the coastline. The people piloting those boats believed they were invisible. They thought the night, the speed, and their sheer numbers made them untouchable. But they were wrong. They weren't racing into open water, they were racing into a meticulously designed trap. Just a few miles away, hidden in the darkness with all electronic emissions cut, was a massive Arleigh Burke-class destroyer. Flanking it were Navy SEAL teams and Coast Guard cutters sitting in absolute silence. They had created a kill box, a zone of no return, and they had been waiting weeks for this exact moment. The smugglers thought they had outsmarted the system, but in reality, they were sailing directly into the most sophisticated ambush in modern maritime history. So, what actually happens when a billion-dollar criminal fleet runs headfirst into the US Navy? Let's find out. When the FBI finally reconstructed their route map, the scale of the problem was terrifying. The fleet would depart from the coast, fanning out in a massive wedge formation to scatter their signal. Then they would converge at a blind spot in international waters, hundreds of miles offshore, outside the normal patrol range of coastal authorities. This time, intelligence indicated they were carrying over 6,000 pounds of high-purity product. The plan was simple: overload the defense. They knew that no Coast Guard cutter or police boat could chase 98 targets moving at 50 knots in different directions. If the authorities caught 5 boats, 93 would still get through. It was a math problem, and the criminals were winning. The FBI realized instantly that civilian law enforcement couldn't handle this. You can't chase a swarm, you have to swallow it whole. They needed a net big enough to catch an entire fleet, and only the military had that kind of reach. This triggered the formation of the Joint Maritime Task Force, involving the Navy, the Coast Guard, and the FBI. Their mission was named Operation Black Current. The goal wasn't just to seize the drugs, it was to completely dismantle the transport network in a single night. Inside the Joint Command Room in Florida, the tension was palpable. The blue light of the monitors illuminated the faces of agents and officers who knew the stakes. They were looking at the new transport model, and it was intimidating. The Navy analysts looked at the heat and radar data. If 98 boats ran at full throttle, their heat signatures would create a fog on the ocean surface, confusing most long-range sensors. The Coast Guard confirmed that pursuing them in open water was impossible. The moment they were engaged, the fleet would scatter in a starburst pattern, breaking in every direction. That's when the Navy strategists proposed the only plan that had a chance of working. They wouldn't chase the boats, they would force the boats to come to them. They studied the ocean floor and the currents. They found a specific corridor between 2 reef lines, exactly 14 nautical miles apart. The currents there were strong and unpredictable. Any speedboat captain wanting to save fuel and maintain stability would have to drive in a straight line through that corridor. It was a natural bottleneck. If the task force could position themselves at the end of that funnel, the smugglers would have nowhere to run. The preparation was intense. An Arleigh Burke destroyer was designated as the mothership for the operation, carrying a specialized team of 12 Navy SEALs trained for boarding actions. Their job was to fast rope down, disable the engines, and secure the high-value targets. A high-speed littoral combat ship, or LCS, was deployed to the outer ring to lock down escape routes, while Coast Guard cutters formed the final blocking layer. But the most critical piece of the puzzle was the eye in the sky, the P8 Poseidon. This aircraft would orbit miles above, using synthetic aperture radar to track the fleet without them ever knowing they were being watched. As the operation date approached, the trap was set. The destroyer ran a fake patrol route to avoid raising suspicion, then went dark. 2 hours before the expected arrival, every active radar on the U.S. ships was shut down. They switched to passive sensors only, listening to the electronic noise of the ocean without emitting a single signal that the smugglers could detect. The entire blockade sat in the water, lights out, engines humming quietly, invisible in the night. At 2:14 a.m., the silence broke, at least on the digital displays. The P8 Poseidon, circling high above the cloud layer, picked up the first signs. The synthetic aperture radar painted a picture of tiny heat dots moving in perfect sync. They appeared as a string of red needles stitching through the black fabric of the sea. The analysis software crunched the data. Speed, 51 to 55 knots. Formation, a slanted rake. This was the signature move of La Corona del Mar. They staggered the boats like saw teeth to distribute their heat signature and confuse satellite imagery. The P8 Poseidon crew immediately pushed the data to the task force. The command center on the destroyer shifted from green to red. The target alert sounded, but nobody moved yet. Discipline was key. The map showed 98 vessels, just as predicted. They were running completely dark, crashing through the waves, their composite hulls slicing the water like hot metal. To anyone on the surface without advanced night vision, they were ghosts. The wind tore past them, masking the roar of nearly 100 engines. On the destroyer, the SEAL team stood on the aft deck, checking their gear. No one spoke. The smell of the salty ocean air was mixed with the metallic scent of weapons and fuel. They rechecked their night vision goggles, harnesses, and engine disabling tools. They knew the rules of engagement. No rash moves. If they engaged too early, the fleet would turn and vanish into the vastness of the Atlantic. They had to wait until the door was closed and locked. At 2:48 a.m., the smugglers made their fatal mistake. The fleet began widening out to the left to avoid the first reef line. It was exactly what the task force had predicted. To correct their course and fight the cross-current, they had to funnel back into the center. They were unknowingly steering directly into the 14-mile gap between the reefs. By 3:42 a.m., the Poseidon reported a formation change. The boats shifted to a tight, sawtooth run, with each boat offset by just a few meters. This required intense concentration from the pilots. They couldn't turn suddenly. They couldn't accelerate randomly. They were locked into their own formation. The trap was working perfectly. The U.S. ships remained silent, massive steel shadows floating in the abyss, waiting for the swarm to enter the effective range. The tension in the command center was excruciating. The officers watched the dots inch closer to the virtual line on the screen. If even one smuggler spotted a silhouette or a reflection, the operation would blow. But the discipline held. At 4:07 a.m., the lead speedboats crossed the invisible boundary of the kill box. 2 minutes later, 30 more followed. Then at 4:12 a.m., it happened. The entire fleet, all 98 vessels, was inside the corridor. The currents were pushing them, the reefs were boxing them in, and the U.S. Navy was waiting at the exit. The trap snapped shut. Suddenly, the night exploded into action. An MH-60R Seahawk helicopter detached from the destroyer, its rotors slicing the air into white swirls. In the open bay, a trained marksman from the specialized Hitron unit locked onto the first target. These snipers are capable of hitting a speedboat engine block from a moving helicopter with inch-perfect accuracy. He didn't aim for the pilots, he aimed for the propulsion. A short, precise burst of fire rang out. The lead speedboat jerked violently as the rounds tore through the engine cowling. The motor sparked and died, leaving the boat dead in the water. Within 70 seconds, 12 more boats suffered the same fate. The precision was surgical. It wasn't a battle, it was a disassembly line. Chaos erupted among the smugglers. They tried to break formation, but the geography was against them. The boats that tried to turn sharply were hit by the cross currents and lost speed, making them easy targets for the marksmen above. Some of the speedboats, carrying impure bootleg fuel to save money, burst into flames when their engines were hit, turning into floating bonfires that illuminated the panic of the fleet. In the center of the chaos, the SEALs made their move. As the smuggler formation disintegrated, the fast ropes dropped from the hovering helicopters. The operators slid down into the darkness, landing on the decks of the moving boats. This is one of the most dangerous maneuvers in maritime combat, boarding a hostile, high-speed vessel at night. But the SEALs moved with terrifying efficiency. Flashbangs detonated, blinding the smugglers with brilliant bursts of light and sound. The resistance was short-lived. The cartel members, armed only with crude personal weapons, were completely overwhelmed by the heavily armored and highly trained operators. On boat number 49, identified as the command vessel, a SEAL team subdued the leader known as El Marino before he could dump his encrypted communications gear overboard. While the boarding team secured the center, the Coast Guard cutters closed the net on the perimeter. Their interceptor boats, small and incredibly fast, chased down the stragglers trying to squeeze through the reef gaps. It was a masterclass in coordination. No boat was allowed to breach the line. Within 27 minutes, the operation was effectively over. The sun hadn't even risen yet, and the fleet of La Corona del Mar had ceased to exist. The summary on the command screen told the story. 41 speedboats disabled, 39 seized intact, and 18 sunk or destroyed due to engine explosions. The recovery teams moved in, pulling over 6,000 pounds of compressed product from the holds. But as the agents began processing the scene, they realized the drugs were just the tip of the iceberg. The real prize was the technology. The SEALs had recovered the fleet's navigation systems, satellite phones, and low-frequency radios. Because the ambush had been so sudden, the smugglers hadn't had time to wipe the data. Within 48 hours, the FBI was decoding thousands of GPS coordinates. They found the locations of safe houses, fuel depots, and warehouses in 3 different countries. They had the contact list for the entire internal network. In a single night, the cartel didn't just lose $100 million in revenue, they lost their anonymity. The secretive maritime route they had spent years building was exposed. The swarm strategy, which they thought was invincible, had been turned against them. For the U.S. forces, Operation Black Current became a textbook example of modern warfare. It proved that you don't fight a swarm by chasing it, you fight it by being smarter. The report to the Department of Defense summed it up in one line: no formation runs faster than a perfectly prepared kill box. As the prisoners were transferred to the destroyer and the sun began to rise over the Caribbean, the ocean returned to its deceptive calm. There was no trace of the chaotic battle that had just taken place, other than the long line of seized boats being towed back to port. It was a reminder that national security often relies on the silent, unseen work of thousands of people. While the world sleeps, there are eyes in the sky and steel in the water, waiting for the next threat to cross the line. The ocean is vast, and it keeps its secrets well. But on this night, the technology and discipline of the U.S. Navy proved that there is nowhere to hide when the good guys control the map.